So this is my class in C.S. Lewis. As I said to you just before I went on camera, Dr. Davis had this class, Apologetics of C.S. Lewis, looking at Lewis as a philosopher and the particular ways in which Lewis speaks persuasively as a philosopher in a variety of his works. And I'm not going to replicate any of the works that he's dealt with. Which is not to say that I don't think the works are important or that I am not interested in Lewis as an apologist, because I'm also interested in Lewis as an apologist. But the way in which I see him as an apologist probably differs slightly from Dr. Davis. You'll be able to tell me at the end. I think we both can see them, his advantages differently, even as an apologist. But I'm not going to look at him solely as an apologist. I'm going to look at him in three ways. I'm going to look at him, English literature is my métier, so I'm going to look at him as a writer of fiction. I am going to look at him as a literary critic, because he was an academic like me. He was a medievalist, taught both medieval and Renaissance literature. Eventually at Cambridge University, they gave him a chair dedicated to the study of medieval and Renaissance literature, which, if you know anything about the discipline of English, are usually kept entirely separate, different eras. And often one is seen as the repudiation of the other. The Renaissance is the return to a rational way of looking at the world, whereas the medieval world was backwards and benighted and full of Christian mumbo jumbo, irrational. That's the portrait. It's the Dark Ages. The medieval period is the Dark Ages. Lewis entirely disagreed with this point of view and will, towards the end of his career, argue that there's far more continuity between the periods than there is discontinuity. Not that there aren't differences that deserve to be attended to, but there's a huge overlap. And that is going to be what I'm looking at when I come to look in, never mind the days here, but in 2 weeks' time, when we look at the discarded image. The discarded image is a study of the worldview of the ancient medieval Renaissance world. It will hold all the way up until sometime in the 17th century. What time exactly, it's unclear, because it doesn't, when he says the discarded image, it doesn't get thrown away immediately. It gets held on to. In hymnody even, we'll talk about the rolling of the spheres, which refers to a cosmology that was debunked a few hundred years before that. In the 19th century, they'll still be referring to this. But it's about changing a whole way of knowledge in relation to the world that is a process that's undergoing as the modern era is changing. And there are decisive moments in that. I'll come to that later on the course when we look at that decisive moment, which he puts roughly sometime in the mid-19th century. I'll say more about that, more specific things about that when we come to that. That will be in this lecture on De Descriptione Temporum, which was his maiden lecture as the professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, in which he talked about the ages. The temporum is the eras. And he's going to talk about the division between medieval and Renaissance, which has been pulled back together by himself, but he's going to say actually the eras aren't really by centuries, they're by ages, and we have more in common with the ancient world. We Christians have more in common with the ancient classical world than we do with our contemporaries, and hence my division here between Lewis and contemporaries. When Lewis speaks, he's going to speak to some degree on the behalf of the Christian world. In the 20th century, he's a man out of his time. He's an anachronism. He's a dinosaur in terms of the way his contemporaries look at him. He will argue that because he speaks of a philosophy that is eternally correct and is unchanging and true, the truth does not change. The way in which the world has changed doesn't necessarily mean the world is right, even if it's called knowledge or science. And he's going to get into that, and this is the way I've framed the course. In the first work, we'll look at the Abolition of Man, which is a short little book. It was 3 lectures he gave at the University of Durham, my alma mater, in 1943. 3 lectures. And they engaged with the problem of modern science. And in particular, that the idea that the cultural reins over education, over politics, over economics, were being handed over to an elite group of experts in the name of science. And to quote him from that passage, he worried that this was fundamentally subversive of a free society. Handing over the reins of governance over politics, economics, science, education, healthcare, sociology to an elite group of oligarchs was fundamentally subversive, not just incidentally, fundamentally. And he worried that they would, this oligarchy of experts would increasingly, now I'm quoting, increasingly rely on the advice of scientists till in the end the politicians proper become merely the scientists' puppets. Now this seems rather apropos when you consider what happened during COVID, when we had to trust the science, that was the language, and we saw that it wasn't even the scientists that were leading the discussion, it was computer modeling. Because it wasn't data, they didn't have data. You don't have data till after the fact. You have projections of what might happen in various scenarios according to various computational modeling of what could happen. And so the ripcord was pulled very quickly on COVID because they projected millions globally dying, tens of millions, sometimes even more than that. And so the science was dictating policy then. And so what Lewis says there seemed rather, as I say, apropos to me. But what's interesting to me is not his commentary on the relevance of what happened in 2020 and following, but more the way in which it engages with our contemporary world in general. So my argument is going to be that Lewis is actually helping us think about what is going on around us in a critical way. We might not always agree with him. I tend to almost always agree with him, but not always. But he is going to give us a different way of looking at contemporary issues. Because in this case, I'll say expert opinion, he's worried about the same problems that Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells and what's his name? George Orwell. He's worried about the same problems. That's the world of the 20th century. It's the world of 2 world wars, one of which he was directly involved in. He fought in the trenches in the World War I, and the other in which he's famously broadcasting on the radio, the BBC, what eventually becomes Mere Christianity, how to see what's going on and to think about politics and ethics and social life. He's going to engage in a public, very public fashion through the national broadcaster and help them think through what's going on, which in many ways was unprecedented, which is a totalitarian form of warfare. Nation states, it's called a world war for a reason. There had never been such a thing. The entire globe involved in a war in which they all thought they were going to win, and they all thought that it needed to be fought to the last man, or else they were going to perish. It was an existential war. It wasn't just for grabbing some land or grabbing some wealth. It was seen as an existential struggle. And that's partly because of the scientific views of the day, which were dominated by Darwinism. Survival of the fittest begs the question, if that is the model of biology we have, it's going to fit in with our sense of human nature and the ultimate reality. And the ultimate reality of Darwinism is change and evolution to something superior. But then the question is begged, which of the nation states which have the benefit of science and technology is the superior nation or the superior race? Because Darwinism divides up people into races. Which is the master race? That's the issue at stake in both the First and the Second World Wars. It's not just the Second World War thing. It becomes famous because of Hitler and the Aryan race and all that, but actually it's at stake in the First World War as well. And each one of the nation states think that the war is going to be over within weeks. They all think it. They rush into it. They say the technology will allow us to get troops from here to here, tens and hundreds of thousands, extraordinarily quickly. It will change warfare, and we will have it over very quickly. As we know, with the benefit of the hindsight of history, it ended up being trench warfare for 4 years in which they fought over about a couple of miles of battleground and died in mud. Both Lewis and Tolkien, who I'll talk about next semester when we look at Lewis yet again and add Tolkien to the mix, experienced how awful and soul-destroying that war was. And it didn't go away in the Second World War. So in terms of the syllabus here, we'll start with the Abolition of Man, which is actually a treatise about education. What category do I put that under? I said Lewis, I'm going to look at Lewis as an apologist. I'm going to look at him as an academic, a literary critic, and I'm going to look at him as a writer of fiction. The Abolition of Man seems like none of the three. He's not defending the Christian faith in the Abolition of Man. He's not engaging as a literary critic, although you're going to find in both cases he needs both of those hats to engage with what's going on in the field of education of his day. And it's not a work of fiction. It's a series of lectures on what's going on in the world around him, specifically the use by an oligarchy of conditioners, of people who are conditioning life scientifically to determine the outcome, and we are giving them control to the point where the politicians are just doing what the scientists, what the experts tell them. And you will hear that discourse on the radio, TV, social media, whatever, to this day. Well, what do the experts say? I just look to the experts. Every politician just says, I'm following the knowledgeable people's advice, and that's what good politics is. And so he's going to talk about the transformation of politics. There are essays in which he talks about this. We associate Hitler with the Führer, but the Führer, the leader, is just following the spirit of the age and the will of the people. And the will of the people is expressed in the science, because the people are to be understood as a herd, the German folk. And they have a purpose and a destiny, and the purpose is to master the other nations. Why has Germany been made the most advanced society in the 20th century, culturally, in the 19th and 20th century? Britain has an empire, but Germany has all the culture. In the arts, in the music, in the universities, the Germans dominate everything for a century and a half. Germany is clearly the superior culture. And yet the Germans are the ones that are annihilating and massacring people in the most barbaric fashion imaginable, just treating other human beings like subhumans, using language of that as Untermenschen, or worse, far worse words in German for, interestingly, and I noted this when I was writing on COVID in Epoch Times, they actually used the language of a virus, and the health of the body of the German people had been infected by a virus, and what was the virus? It was the Jewish people. So you had to separate, you had to cut out the virus, eradicate the virus, because if you didn't do that, the virus was going to kill the host. So it took on biological language, but it was an existential struggle, because according to the scientific worldview that was operative in the day, The ultimate reality was actually Hegel's notion of the state, which is the voice of the people, is the voice of God. And the voice of the people was differentiated by races and nations. So the ultimate reality wasn't one overall. They discarded that idea of one reality over the all. It was to be understood in terms of an ultimate reality for the Germans, or the ultimate reality for the British or the French or whatever. And they abandoned the idea of a common human nature. Darwinism pushed them in this direction. It did not conceive, as Lewis would, that the view of human nature bequeathed from Christianity is that we are persons and we bear the imago Dei. That's the Christian view. That's not the view of his contemporaries. His contemporaries see us as animals, herd animals. Individuals, no. Persons, no. Bear the image of God? No. Which justifies mass killing. It's just what you do to herd. You have to cull the herd. The language of herds enters into the scientific vocabulary and the political vocabulary. Lewis is going to defend the individual, the worth of an individual soul, which is a very Christian defense. I would say he's an apologist. He is an apologist, but he's going to defend human nature. By the way, and this is interesting, I'll say more about this as the course progresses. In 1971, B.F. Skinner, who is a behaviorist psychologist at Harvard University, wrote a book attacking C.S. Lewis as the defender of freedom and virtue, of the literatures of freedom and virtue. He says that Lewis is the chief defender of the literatures of freedom and virtue. And you might think that he was praising Lewis. He was not. He was saying that the notions of freedom need to give way to scientific management techniques, and the idea of virtue is an impediment to that as well. The purpose of education is not to train you in wisdom and virtue, which Lewis believed, and I believe. That's what education is. Education is training in wisdom and virtue. What is education in the eyes of his contemporaries? Well, we're going to answer that question when we look at the Abolition of Man. He's going to read a sixth form textbook we'll call high school, grade 12 textbook, and he's going to engage with it. And he has the book, it's right in front of them. I'll tell you more about that book when we come to it. But he's going to look at the view of education and the purpose of education according to those that he calls the conditioners. He's not one of them. They are opposed to one another. So there's a hot battle going on right there. And that's not even here. That will enter in. Education is going to contain all of those things that I've listed here on, I guess it's on your left. It's going to engage with the nature of ultimate reality. It's going to engage with human nature. It's going to engage with the fundamental problem of life and the fundamental solution of life. It's going to engage with human knowledge. How do we know things? What does it mean to know things? This is epistemology, if you will. It's going to deal with ethics and politics and society. It's going to deal with the purpose and meaning of human life. And finally, it will have a notion of history. What's history for? What's our view of history? Most people don't even know that there are different views of history. The Greco-Roman world had a cyclical view of history. I think most people have heard that by the time they get to second, third year at any rate. They thought that history repeated itself in a cycle. They talked about ages. There was a golden age, and there was some sort of original sin. They don't use that term, but there was some sort of a rebellion within the Godhead. Usually a son rebelled against his father, and it brought about a deterioration, which led to further deterioration from the gold to the silver to the Bronze Age, in which Homer's heroes fought, the Bronze Age, the heroic age, the age of Beowulf, when men are godlike and fighting against monsters, giant beasts. That's so much of the imagination of Lewis and Tolkien as well, that age where men were greater than we, and we could nonetheless learn from them. But then we're in the Iron Age, and that's the age of men, if you will. It's not a good age. Tolkien presents it. At the end, you might think this is a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's worse. Except it's also better, because the age of men, if you're a Christian, is the age when God became man. God took on human flesh. And he redeemed us from the basic human problem, which is not of knowledge, but of sin. There's the basic problem, and the solution is redemption. Whereas the problem for our contemporaries is of knowledge. Ultimate reality is what? What the zeitgeist says. That's the ultimate reality. In other words, it's not ultimate at all, but it will be ultimate at the time. It will lead everything. We'll trust the spirit of the age. That's the German word here. Zeit is time, and Geist, spirit. As far as human nature goes, well, you have one of two conceptions. I'll say a lot more about this over the course, because this is a particular area of interest for me. The Christian conception is that we are persons and that God is personal, tri-personal, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We talk about humans as persons because God himself is person and we bear his image. And that means every individual, not herd now, individual bears the image of God, and therefore that person's life has a sanctity to it because they bear the image of God. Not because they're gods, but because they bear the image of God. That's the Christian conception. So if that's the case, then that person has certain prerogatives and rights, if you will. Freedom becomes important. Virtue becomes important. If sin enters into the game, there's a sort of a moral deterioration. So human nature here, on the one hand, it becomes very noumenal. It becomes very much of a spiritual. Human nature is spiritual. Not in the sense of the Holy Spirit, in the sense of a non-corporeal entity. The scientists are superior human beings because they're more intellectual. We'll come to that throughout, as I say, this course and the next one. Next one I'll get into is science fiction, Lewis's science fiction. I'm not doing that on this course, but next course we'll engage with that directly. On the one hand, he's more spiritual. On the other hand, he's just an animal, a herd animal at that. And he's evolving. That's what human nature is. It's an evolving, it's a trousered ape, as Lewis says it in one place. We're trousered apes. We got bigger brains, and those are the mark of our evolution from the smaller brained entities. Totally denies a spiritual nature, totally denies a moral nature. He will get into that in the Abolition of Man. In terms of the issue of human knowledge, well, the issue of human knowledge is going to be contingent on the way God made the world, according to Lewis. Human knowledge is actually replicating God's thoughts after him. And you can replicate that in a multiplicity of ways, but one of them is by looking at the way God created the world and everything in it. And the other is by reading Scripture, more importantly, where God reveals his ways, his actions, and history, that he is personal. All sorts of things are revealed there, but that's how we acquire human knowledge, is we understand that we have lost in the Garden of Eden something of the original knowledge of Adam and Eve. So knowledge, according to this, is a recovery process. Whereas here, and that recovery can take the pattern of discovery, but it's ultimately not new knowledge. It's already there. Whereas here it has more the sense of human knowledge is really creation, almost out of nothing. This is how it's presented, at least in the Romantic conception. I don't want to fill this all out right now, but I'm going to engage with this repeatedly, so you might want to just keep it in your mind's eye. And then the purpose of human life then will be to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, because one of the concepts of history here is that history has a meaning and a purpose. It has a beginning and an end. It's not just linear in the sense that it has a beginning and end. It's eschatological in the sense that it progresses, but not in the modern sense of progress towards something that it never defines. It's just superior in the way Darwinist evolution says that it gets up higher and higher, but it doesn't define higher. Never defines higher. It only defines lower. And what's lower, it's trying to get rid of. So the tendency of Darwinism leads us towards thinking that corporeal human nature is a detestable thing, something we want to depart from, and hence the interest in exploring outer space. He'll get into that. I'll talk about that again next semester when we look at the space trilogy. Like, why are we suddenly fascinated? Who wants to go up into, like, I love science fiction. I grew up watching the TV shows, the Star Treks. I'm very interested in that. But why? Why do people want to leave planet Earth? One of my favorite thinkers, Hannah Arendt, talked about this in her book, The Human Condition, and described the mission into landing into space as if it were a liberation from a prison. The Earth is a prison cell. And we're emancipating ourselves from a corporeal, physical existence and the conditions of life. We're moving beyond conditions to an unconditioned spatial existence. It's very odd if you listen to people and they wax poetic over leaving planet Earth and what it will mean. It differs from person to person. Some people say, well, it's great because there's water on Mars and we could live there then. And you think, well, why would we want to leave the Earth to go to Mars where the conditions are terrible? Aside from maybe there's ice in the center of the planet, maybe I'm wrong about Mars, but there's one of the planets allegedly has, they believe, some sort of water in the present. If they can do that, then we can produce oxygen and thereby live there. I think, well, but why would we want to do that? Why would that even be an attractive proposition? Other than it hasn't been done before. And maybe that's also part of the point. So he will also note there's a bizarre desire among the elites to, in a quasi-Gnostic way, to talk about knowledge that they possess and can't share with other people, and a governance posture that they have, which means that they will direct everybody else towards that end, even if it means the annihilation of the human race. Even if it means the annihilation of the human race. We'll get to that next semester, and those words are actually put directly into Weston's mouth. By the way, Hitler, as terrible as he was to the Jewish people, also was terrible to the German people. When it was clear that the war was not going to be won, he was happy to send his troops into battle to annihilate themselves because they hadn't sufficiently obeyed his orders and committed themselves to progress, which is why they were losing. Because otherwise they would win, right? Because they were the master race, but I guess they weren't. So they deserved to die. They should go down in flames, giving crazy orders at the end of his regime. Because again, there's this maniacal belief in power and control, even if power and control comes at the expense of all life. Lewis is going to address this in a scientific fashion. So the sci-fi trilogy is going to loom large. I'll talk about that next semester. But he is not going to keep it in that framework. He will in the sci-fi trilogy. He'll explicitly engage it on those terms. But in other works, like the ones I'm looking at in the course, let me just get this out of the way because it's probably blocking things here a little bit. But in other works in the course, he's going to calibrate it, and this is characteristic of Lewis's fiction and what makes it so good. He brings it back into a different frame of reference and a different way of understanding all of those things that I put on the whiteboard there, the terms of ultimate reality, the notion of human nature, the fundamental problem of life and its solution, the idea of human knowledge, what does it mean, what's the purpose of knowledge, what's its character, what does it mean to live ethically and do good politics and have a just society, what's the purpose of human life, what is human history, how do we understand human history. Christians have answers to all of these questions, distinct answers. And in general, the characteristic feature of Lewis's writing, all of it, is he connects it to love. He's an Augustinian. I'm going to cast Lewis in the Augustinian tradition, which you could say is the Pauline tradition, that the chief virtue, and it's not only a virtue, but the main way of understanding everything is in terms of love. And this will just simply raise the problem of love. We'll get to this, unfortunately, only towards the end of the course, but I didn't know what order to put these in. But in the 4 loves, he'll talk about different types of love. What do we mean by love? To this day, people sing about love. They're moved by love. Lewis will give a Christian conception of what love is, and he'll use the 4 Greek words to differentiate types of love that he can see in the ancient world that still apply to this day. And we will conclude with the weight of glory, in which he talks about something that is going to connect those 7 different features that I wrote on the whiteboard there. The idea that God is real, substantial, loving, and everything it acts in accordance with his good and perfect will. And human life has a purpose and a meaning because he loves us. And we're made in the image of he whose name is love. And that will be the dominant feature not only of the 4 loves, but of his whole discussion in Mere Christianity. It's going to actually be related to that as well. So I'm going to teach it differently than if I were a philosopher talking in apologetics. I'm going to talk about it more in theological terms and also in the terms of his fiction. Till We Have Faces is his best book, first of all, but it's about the fictional story of Psyche, the goddess of love. And he will engage with this and cast it in Christian terms, we're going to find. Cupid and Psyche. Likewise, in The Great Divorce, it's about a time after death. Where you go, where do you go? How is it calibrated? What's life like after death? It's, again, love will be the factor that allows his whole fictional world to revolve. It's the fixed point. Narnia Chronicles, I'm only going to deal with 6 of the 7. I haven't named them yet because I still haven't decided. Love is the dominant motif that pulls them all together. I'll explain that. I'll justify it at this point. I'm just going to assert it, and then hopefully you'll see that. But I'm convinced that love is the key to understanding Lewis's thought in an Augustinian sense. I'll have to explain what I mean by that. But yes?
If love is his dominant kind of connecting piece for all these things, why are we ending off the semester with it rather than beginning it?
Because I want to, because I'm an artist and I want to build to a crescendo. I want to begin with the problem. It could start with a solution. And so this is my own dilemma in teaching the course. Where do I begin? I mean, I've divided, and you can see this, so the discarded humanities, these at the beginning, I said, the Abolition of Man, what does this relate to? If I said that he is a literary critic, that he writes fiction, and that he's an apologist, he's got those 3 arrows in his quiver, what is the Abolition of Man? It's none of those 3. Not really. So I want to look at him in a sort of a total way, and I could cast him as well as the defender of freedom and virtue, which I also think is true. And B.F. Skinner's critique of him, that this is what's wrong with him makes me want to say, yes, you're right. That's exactly what's right about him. He is the defender of freedom and virtue. But he's more than that, because he's defending a different view of love and a different view of life. A very different view. It's not the social scientific view of B.F. Skinner. It is not the view that regards human beings as lab rats for the scientists to conduct experiments upon. His view of science is different than B.F. Skinner's view of science. So it's implicit, the love is implicit there at the beginning. It becomes more and more explicit as the course progresses. But it's a great question. Why, if you think that's the main thing, why don't you lead with that? Well, I have led with it. I've given you the introduction. And that, as I say, but that will help you orient it as you go along. And so I'm casting Lewis as an Augustinian in the great Christian tradition of thought, and to whom he refers repeatedly, including in works that I didn't cite here. So in his literary criticism, his preface to Paradise Lost. If you ever read the preface to Paradise Lost, I'll teach Milton next semester, and I recommend it. He talks about his Augustinian notion of good and evil, and how it actually frames Milton's portrait in that great epic work. That evil is, as Augustine put it, the privation of the good. There is no such thing as evil. Strictly speaking, there is the privation of the good. What we call evil is our feeling, our perception that there's something not good. And that's a better way of putting it. Evil is not an entity unto itself. It's a not good. There's good, there's not good. That's how God calls it, by the way, in Genesis. Even before evil creeps into the garden and original sin takes place, he says it's not good for man to be alone. It's a lot of weight in that phrase, because everything up to this point is good. He creates and it's good, and it's good, and it's good. There's a lot of good. And then when mankind is created, it's very good. It's good. And then just in Genesis 2, it's not good for man to be alone. Not good. Does it mean it's evil? No, it doesn't. There's something lacking, however, in the solitary individual that bears the image of God. And it's expressed in Genesis 1:26. The two together, Adam and Eve. So when it comes to the creation of mankind, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Quoting the way it's put. But the two together bear the image of God in some way that the individuals, although he still does, there's something lacking. So there's a social dimension, which again, theologians will say reflects on the personhood of God, who's triune in his personhood as well. So don't think of it as a monad. And don't think of evil as a thing that is opposed to the good, or as if we lived in a dualistic or Manichaean universe where good and evil are battling it out like in Star Wars. And they're equal and opposite powers. And maybe the evil is going to win even. And we see more. That's the wrong way of looking at life, says Augustine. And theologically and even rationally, he's correct. It's not just theologically. You will find rationally, if you don't hold on to the Christian view of good and evil, that you end up in all sorts of problems. Yes?
Well, agreed that good and evil are not equal in the sense that of power. It will be lesser. And I agree with the following of what Genesis presents as evil begins as not good. But eventually, do we not get in Genesis' story, evil does become, in a way, its own entity with the presentation of the snake. It is not good, but it's a continuation and seen to be more set in stone as its own sort of entity and such. Because then later on you get humanity, the reason we get redemption is because, well, we were tricked into doing evil. Whereas the serpent shows that in everybody's own course.
Yeah, so when we talk about Satan as evil, or sin as evil, and talk about the problem of evil, and my colleagues, philosophers, write on this. Dr. Franks has a book on the problem of evil, and the different conceptions of what we mean by evil. In Christian theology, Satan, although he is the adversary of God, is not the essence of evil, because he's still a creature. He's God's creature. He's a being created by God under God's sovereign rule. God rules over Satan. This is one of the things that Milton gets into when we looked at Paradise Lost in first year, and Milton got into this quite strongly, particularly in Book 3 of Paradise Lost, the idea that he created man good, sufficient to have stood though free to fall, such created he all those who are free, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves, he says. Man's born, created to be free, and has the freedom, and if he had not such freedom, then he could never love. So freedom is a necessary attribute of creatures who are going to bear the image of God, because it's a prerequisite for love. Love can't be conditioned. It can't be given as an injection. There's something different than there. There's an attribute necessary for love to, what we call love, to be love. So Satan is, although he's portrayed and we call him evil, we do so not very carefully, which is not to say that he's a good guy or that I'm expressing sympathy for the devil. I'm just saying that he is not evil in the same sense that we mean good is good, and he's just on the opposite side. He isn't. There is no. That's not correct. Gives him too much credit. But we'll get into that issue as well. Certainly there are things that we read from Scripture that are going to suggest enormous power, far beyond human capacity. But is he God? Well, he claims to be. But it's clear from what Scripture says and all discussions in Christian theology that it is not so. The fact that we in the 20th century seem to be seeing a manifestation of evil on a scale that is hitherto unknown begs a different question, which is, what exactly do we see? Friedrich Nietzsche, about whom Jordan Peterson thinks so much, calls it the death of God. God is dead and we've killed him. A more profound thinker than Jordan Peterson and Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Buber, will talk about it in different terms. It's the eclipse of God. I was going to bring the book. I tried to get it out of the library. I couldn't find it on my shelf. It's probably at home or something. The eclipse of God. Namely, God is still there, but he's been eclipsed. What has he been eclipsed by? The darkness. There's a sense of the permanent things that God has created, including the image of God, the discarded image, have been cast aside, covered over, hidden. By whom? Well, chiefly by human beings. They've thrown off God and his fetters, like we see in Psalm 2. Why the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain against the Lord and his anointed one, right? But they do. And in the 20th century, the nations rage and try and cast off everything that might associate life with God. So we get an enormous, in the Western world, an enormous expression of atheism, practical atheism. Even some people call themselves atheists, but within the churches, people are practical atheists, even if they call themselves Christians. They don't act like or think like God rules over all things, that love triumphs over all ills, that the path of ethics and politics is not love, that they don't act that way. They follow modern sociology and terms of crowd control and conditioning and so forth, whether they're conservatives or they're so-called liberals. They operate under the same, they go to public secular universities which have abandoned everything that Lewis will hold dear. Everything. Those will become nonsensical thoughts. What I'm uttering here may be nonsensical thoughts. I can defend them. They're defensible. The position that opposes them is nonsensical, but it's predicated on Darwinism in terms of its science, and on the spirit of the age in terms of its what ultimate reality and what the purpose and meaning of history is. And the result of it is, in our 20th century and 21st century, a growth in despair like no other period. It's the direct product of the teaching they've been given. There is no purpose or meaning to life. So I stick glued to my phone all day to try and be connected and be more distressed afterwards than I was before. I'm seeking the thing that is persecuting. It's like the ring, the ring of power. It's the glowing box in your hand, recording me as we speak. But I will go through. So the Abolition of Man, it's in there. I didn't know where to put it, but it's going to deal with modern education again, because I wanted to direct Lewis's whole métier of works against the educational paradigm of his day. And he will come at that in various ways. He'll do it as an educator. So we'll begin with his literary criticism and his view of what once was considered knowledge and now has been discarded and not called knowledge anymore at all. I'm going to argue that it remains knowledge and rational and coherent, because wisdom and virtue have not changed, because human nature has not changed, actually. We are no better than our forebears. In many ways, we are much worse. In terms of wisdom and virtue, most certainly so. Even in terms of, I don't believe in evolution. The only thing that we see in terms of human biology is a weaker species than before. More genetic mutations. That's not evolution. That's the opposite. That's entropy. Those are copying errors. We have more health problems now. Science may be more advanced in certain respects, but in other respects, it's lost its purpose and meaning. So in medicine, they used to swear the Hippocratic oath, not Hippocratic oath, Hippocratic oath, which began to first do no harm. First. Now they swear the Hippocratic oath in medical schools, and they have removed that line. It's gone. It's been gone for decades. So medicine that has adjured the notion of first avoiding harm is now allowing harm to take place in the process of healing. Well, what's the difference between healing and hurting then? Where's the ethical accountability? It's in the consent of the subject to the experiment. What if you waive the consent? It was a feature of medical ethics from the time of the Nazi period. It was called the Nuremberg Code. You had to do a whole series of things. Informed consent of the subject to the experiment, and had to know all the things that went on. It was waived during COVID. Informed consent, because it was an emergency. All of those things get brought in with a different paradigm of knowledge, a different paradigm of science, a different understanding of what constitutes science, of the methodology of science, et cetera, et cetera. This is not going to be about science fiction. That's next semester. But I'm going to begin with that because it's really about education. And I still think the education is a great way to begin with this. And we will find in the Abolition of Man, I'll say this more next class, he will refer to Augustine's Ordo Amoris in it. And you may say, what on earth is that? And I'll have to explain it to you, because I'm sure it's never been taught. But it's the order of love. But what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the order of love? And where does he get that phrase from? Because he just assumes you know it. And I guarantee you don't know it. Or I didn't know it when I read it. He just passed over it. We will talk about that. Then we'll go to the discarded image. The discarded image will deal with the knowledge base that had been inherited through the wisdom of generations, had been adopted and transformed by Christian doctrine, so that there's some sort of a fusion of the classical world with Christianity. The 7 liberal arts were changed under Christian teaching to create something that we call the university, which is a medieval Christian institution. Did not exist in the ancient world. There was a unity to all knowledge, because God created all things. It had the idea of a creator, essential, not only of human beings, but of the things in it. Essential to the university. without which a university is no longer a university, by the way. Now, more contentious claim, I'll defend that claim as well when the time comes. De Descriptione Temporum, I said to you, this is his lecture connecting the medieval and Renaissance period. He's going to connect more than that. He's going to say everything up till the 19th century, basically, is the old way of knowing. And there are some alterations along the way, but come the 19th century, there's a big shift and a swing that's so monumental that we can't even call it a return to paganism, which Christians tend to, well, the world's pagan. Using the language of Christians of past, our contemporaries are not pagans because they've discarded the idea of virtue. And pagans live their life according to virtue and wisdom. So we have more in common with the pagans, he says, than our contemporaries if we're Christians. We have more in common. Those people were trustworthy. If they gave you their word and they were Germanic, watch out. Their word is their bond. They're going to hold to that. They're going to hold to an idea of honor and dying for their country. The Romans hold this very strongly. They will go into battle and they are willing to die. Why? Because they love something that they're defending there. Our contemporaries have no such justification. They do it because the authorities tell them to. That's not a very good justification, especially when the authorities regard them as herd animals to be slaughtered, if need be. We'll go through the Chronicles of Narnia, then to the Great Divorce, till we have faces. That will conclude the fiction, and then we'll move to what I call apologetics. Well, Mere Christianity is considered that, so that's easy enough. And then I'll come to the Four Loves, which I see as more important than it appears in Lewis's work, even as apologetics. I think the Four Loves is crucial. So I could have stuck it at the beginning of it. Maybe I should. I could still be persuaded, but I just, as long as if you know me, I jump around. I like to talk about the beginning, about the end, and then I come in and out and all the time. It's a step back. It's like the hokey cokey. In, out, back. Big picture, now we'll look at this, then we'll come out and again, and I want you to integrate, because I think that's the way Lewis thinks all the time. And then finally, The Weight of Glory, one of his fantastic sermons given at Oxford University again during the Second World War, and it pulls together the course material, as I say, to a sort of a climax. Any comments or questions? As far as there'll be 2 essays and a final exam. Never mind the dates there, I'll change those, but 2 essays. Do I have a midterm? I have a midterm. Oh, forget that. I'm not doing a midterm. I'll do 2 essays and an exam. Sorry. Or maybe not sorry. That's good? Okay, good. 2 essays and a final exam will be the means of assessment. Any questions at this stage? I said more than I wanted to say. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
In terms of attendance, should we be receiving a code, or are you going to be doing
Never.
it manually?
Yes.
Sweet.
Yeah. I don't believe in conditioning or technological control, so it's me raging against the machine.
Sweet. You and the other teachers.
Oh, really? Following the rebellion. Are the rebels the bad guys or the good guys? They're the good guys, of course.
In Star Wars, they're clearly the good guys.
Clearly, if Star Wars says it, they must be, yeah. Through most books of the 20th century, actually, ironically, and that would not be the way they would be seen historically. But then there's something of the conditioners and the role of technology in the for my part, I don't like the classroom idea that we're being, I want people to want to be here. If you can't be here for whatever reason, as I say, you can watch the lecture afterwards. It's better to be here in person, far better to be here in person. I don't like the sense of compulsion. I don't think it belongs in education. I think you need to have a leisure to do things and to take delight in it, and there's some reward for it. Compulsion doesn't work in love, and it doesn't really work in education very well. When you're small, okay, because at that point, but now you're adults, I want to treat you like adults, and I don't think this treats you like adults, that's all. Yes?
I'm just curious, because we're not covering this book in class, how do you think this idea of love fits in? And like
Which book in class?
Screwtape Letters.
Oh,
I'm curious how you think this theme of
Into screw tape?
Yeah.
Dr. Davis is doing it, right?
No.
Oh, he's not doing screw tape either. Okay, yeah, we're both covering, so, and then next semester I'm doing even more Lewis, and I don't do screw tape either. Well, he's just talking about something, I mean, everything's related to love, and in the case of screw tape, he's saying, if you read the subtext, the senior devil is trying to prevent the, what does he call them? What does he call the person that the junior devil is trying to pervert? What's the term he uses again? The target, whatever. Don't let him think about these things, because it will be, it's healthy. It's the wrong way of looking at it. We must keep him from thinking the wrong thoughts. We must prevent him from loving something. We must make him proud. There are ways, again, you'll find that it fits the way Mere Christianity talks, and again about the idea of love, because in the 4 loves, there are 4 different types of loves, but there are 4 perversions of those types of loves. Screw tape displays those perversions of loves. Make him love the fact that he won a victory here and take pride in it. We want that. Yes, by all means. He's very proud of the fact that he withstood that temptation. The junior devil is upset because he succeeded, and he said, no. His success is far better than his failure. If he had a failure, he would be chastened and might learn some humility. If he thinks that he's superior to this, we can use that. That's the path to the dark side. Something like that, right? That's the path. Make him feel strong. Make him take pride. Make him think he can stand on his own. That's how we bring him down, because he knows that the way that this man will succeed is by giving himself to Christ, exercising humility, the fear of God. We don't want him going in that direction at all. So that's how it fits. It's implicit. Yes?
Calls him your patient.
A patient. Well, there you go even. Ooh, dear. Makes him sound like a psychologist. Yeah. And I don't think that's accidental on Lewis's part. Not that he's demonizing the profession of psychology per se, but he is saying that there's something diabolical about sciences that conduct themselves regarding the patients as non-persons, as not equal image bearers of God. If you start going down that route, your healer may be your destroyer. Apollo is the sun god. The verb from which it derives is to destroy. Apolumi, to destroy. The rays of the sun in Greece will burn through everything, destroy it. It's also the healer, right? So anyway, totally off topic as usual. Anyone else? Okay, well, we're good for now, and I'll see you next time. So